Hello there, I'm Guildmaster Dan, and welcome to the Fourth Wall. It's been a while since I've done a world-building video, and today I thought I'd talk about building your pantheon. So, you already have your world, and you're ready to start filling it with gods. Well, the first thing you need to consider is not what gods you need to make first, or, how to structure your pantheon, all that fun stuff. The first thing you need to ask is whether or not you need to make gods at all. Now, here's a really cool thing. If you're running Dungeons & Dragons, there's lots of sets of gods already out there from other Dungeons & Dragons settings. The Greyhawk gods, the Eberron gods, the Spelljammer gods. There's a whole bunch of different settings out there with sets of gods that you can use that are all filled out, that great to use. And alternatively to that, you can also use pagan gods, the ancient gods of the world, the Olympians, the Norse gods, the Egyptian gods, Hindu gods. You can even use a mix of gods. I was once building a setting where I took different gods from all the different pagan religions and came up with a new pantheon from that, and came up with stories from there. You don't actually need to invent gods if you are just using them to fill in the slot of where divine magic comes from. And even then, you can have a lot of fun using your favorite pagan gods from the different pantheons. So don't be afraid to use those. There's nothing wrong with custom picking your gods from existing gods, or even meshing the two. I've run in campaigns that have meshed, say, the gods of Forgotten Realms and, the Norse gods. I've run in those games. So, first thing to consider is whether or not you need to invent gods at all. It mainly comes down to what purpose those gods are serving. If they're going to be really closely tied to your storyline, then paying more attention to them and inventing your own might be just fine, or even if you just want to fill it up with your own gods, it's fine too. But consider whether or not you need to, because there are plenty of gods to choose from already with existing relationships, domains, realms, all that fun stuff. But let's say, that's not for me. I want to invent my own gods. I want to fill this world up with my creativity and see what divine beings I can invent for this place. Well, there are three things I want you to consider when it comes time to design your pantheon. Before we even get to the composition aspect of it, meaning how the gods are existing in this world, the first thing we need to consider is how prevalent the gods are in our setting. Or another way to put it is, how much interest do they have in the mortal world? Similar to the magic video, there's multiple levels here to go from, and I'm going to go ahead and start with, actually on the flip side of the most influential, the most active version. The first level of gods in the world is the active level. This is when you have gods that live on the mortal plane. These are the gods that live and rule amongst mortals. They are here day to day. They actively go out into the world and change things. They rule over mortals. You'll have dark gods ruling evil kingdoms. You'll have gods that dwell on top of mountains that anyone can go and visit if they're, tenacious enough. You have gods living and changing in the material world amongst the mortals. The next level is influential. Now, this is where the gods may enter onto the material plane sometimes and may walk amongst mortals sometimes, but it's more rare. They don't live in the material world. They live on their own plane of existence, or maybe in a special location world, a la, Mount Olympus. And sometimes they come down and interact, maybe because they're bored, or because more often than not, because they're bored, or because they want to get back at one another. Gods can be kind of squabbly that way. But this is the level where it sometimes happens, but they predominantly live elsewhere. They have some interest in mortal men and women, mortal races, but they also have their own stuff going on elsewhere over here. The level up from there is the disinterested level. This is where the gods exist primarily on a different plane of existence, where they are more concerned with what is going on up here in their plane of existence, which may overlap with the material plane. Now, they still have influence on the material plane and amongst mortals, and actually their power permeates the world. They may represent aspects of the material world, and that's where their churches and their followers and their cults draw their power from. And when they're drawing it from that aspect of the world, they're drawing it from those gods. Those gods may have appeared in the world, like, say, at the beginning of time, in the ancient times, but have since left or are no longer concerned with the matters of mortals. They are on their own level. Their influence can be felt in the world. Their followers can still tap their power, harness it to do good or evil. You may even come across champions or avatars of these gods, beings or mortals who have raised themselves to almost a demigodhood, or have been raised to demigodhood. This is where you'll have the least interaction with mortal races, this is the least interaction so far with mortal races of the gods. There is one more level above this, but on this level, it's mostly just influence that you'll see. You won't ever really see the gods. You may see agents of the gods, such as angels or demons. You may see those enter in the world, and even then, those can be kind of rare. You might hear more stories of those than actually see them, unless you're an adventurer. But there will be churches, there may be champions, and there may be agents of those gods, but you will very rarely ever see those gods. Typically, if you wanted to see them, you have to travel to their plane of existence, which is usually almost always lethal for humans. But now, the level above this is what I like to call Lovecraftian. This is the level where gods just don't even notice the material plane. The material plane is so beneath their notice. The gods are so out of our purview, so out of our understanding, that the level that they exist on, we cannot even comprehend. They are so powerful, so beyond us, that they might as well not exist at all. They do exist, and in fact, the effects of their struggle affect mortals, but beyond that, if the mortals ever interact with divine entities, it's like 3 removed. This is where in Lovecraft, you have the old gods, which are essentially this level. They are gods that don't notice mortals at all. In fact, Cthulhu, this big eldritch beast, this magically, telepathically enabled being from beyond time and space that is awakened from an ancient dead city that dreams until he awakens, is just a priest. He is just a priest to what the actual gods are. We are to Cthulhu what Cthulhu is to the actual gods. We are that far removed. And in this sort of setting, you're going to see the gods really far off. You may learn of a name of a god. More often than not, you will identify with gods more by their agents or by just the sheer force of nature that they represent. Beyond that, the gods are so beyond mortals that it's not even a concern. To look upon or to hear one such being would end your life with how beyond the mortal plane they are. So you want to pick which one of these things you want to go off of, because one of these levels you want to go off, because it's going to determine a lot of things for your pantheon. For one thing, if you go with the Lovecraftian thing, you don't even have to name your gods. You may want to come up with a few forces of nature and come up with some agents, some NPCs to those forces of nature to represent their agents, but you don't actually need to even name the gods. They're more aspects to the world than anything. Or you may have the active, where they're really amongst mortals. And, in this case, you may have gods of multiple different races, and they're going to be more of NPCs. Like, they have full histories that you can go off of. You can actually go and meet them if, you're tenacious enough. Or you may have met them and never knew it, depending upon the god. You want to pick which one because it's going to determine what sort of gods you're going to end up building. Once you've picked your level of prevalence or interest of the gods, next you want to look at your composition. Now, what I mean by composition is, once again, this is similar to the composition of magic. This is the actual state of the gods. This is the metaphysics behind how these divine beings exist. Such as, are they immortal or are they just powerful? Is it that they actually have divinity, or that they are just so far beyond normal men that they are powerful? Such as kaiju-like beasts are the gods of this world. It's just that they are so far more powerful than mortal beings that they're worshipped as gods. Versus actual, say, Olympians walking around wielding divine power while ruling over men and women. Are they ascendant or are they inherent? Were they born gods, or were they once mortal and ascended to godhood? I've seen a lot of fantasy settings where the gods actually are comprised of ancient, legendary heroes. These heroes did such great deeds that they actually gained godhood. Now, typically, even if you have the ascendant gods, you typically will have at least one inherent god or some force of divinity. Like, maybe all these ancient heroes ate from the fruit of a divine tree. Like, the tree itself isn't a god, but it grants divinity. And, from there, that's where all of the ascendant heroes gained their godhood. Are you dealing with a monotheistic pantheon, a polytheistic pantheon, or what I like to call a multitheistic pantheon? A monotheistic pantheon isn't really a pantheon, it means one god. This is similar to our world, where there are multiple monotheist religions that worship a single god. There may be lots of characters underneath that god in the theology/mythology, lots of agents to that god and different forces, but the only one is an actual god. You might have polytheist. You might have a polytheist pantheon, and this is like what you're used to in fantasy settings, with many gods being in a single pantheon. More often than not, they're typically family, or they're all created from the same source. This is where you're dealing with a single pantheon. And the third option that I like to call multitheist or multitheistic pantheon is actually an existence of multiple types of religions, where you may have one pantheon of gods over here, and you may have a monotheistic god over here, and they are completely separate religions, completely separate sources of power, but they have actual power over the world at the same time. Whether it's believed, say, by the polytheists that this monotheist god is actually a split-off member from their pantheon, or the monotheist god believes that the polytheistic gods are all pretenders, or maybe both. Maybe that's just what mortals think about them. You can run into multiple different types of religion with multiple pantheons in there. You may have a setting where you have multiple pantheons at war. Say you took the three big pagan pantheons, the Greek pantheon, the Norse pantheon, and the Egyptian pantheon, and in your fantasy world, those three pantheons rule over three realms, and they're all at war. The gods being at war, so the realms are at war. Or take, for example, a setting I was doing a while back that had three sets of gods. It had the old gods, which were actually Lovecraftian beings beyond time and space that had manifestations in reality that granted power, and they were worshipped because humans saw the power that these manifestations granted. You had the new gods that were actually just powerful beings from another world that had came here and started to rule because they wanted to shape the mortals here. And then you had worship of the planet itself because the planet itself was alive and filled with magic, filled with divinity in its own right. And all three of them had their own creation stories, all had their own theories about how the world worked. They were three separate religions with three separate sects or deities, and they all were forced to interact. Naturally, some were in conflict, some weren't. Some were just kind of under the radar. This is where you have multiple sources of religion that could be differing, and it's interesting to see how they play off of one another. I find this the most complex system of them, and it can actually be the most fun if you get into it, because you can really see different groups in your world based around these religions and see how they interact with one another, and just you can end up, this is where you get not just a polytheistic world where everybody worships a single patron deity. This is where you actually have, you have the people over here that worship the pantheon as kind of like a whole unit, and then you have the people over here that worship the monotheistic deity. Think Game of Thrones with the Lord of Light and then the Seven. They're two separate religions that seem to have some manner of power in the world. And then kind of over here, you also add in at least the force that is represented by the White Walkers. And you kind of seem to have like a whole nother religion, mythology sort of thing going on, where you have these different forces in the world. And it can get interesting. Now, lastly, let's say, all right, we've already picked, we're going to do active gods, and we are going to have their inherent deities, and it's going to be a polytheistic pantheon. Okay, fine. It's time to make some gods. How do we actually go about making the gods? What do we need to consider? First, being the composition of individual gods. This is actually the personification of the gods. There's a couple of ways of doing this. What you'll see in most cases is where the GM has identified parts of their world that they wish to be personified, aspects of what makes up reality that they wish to be represented by a god. So, say, a god of nature, a god of war, a god of a certain kingdom, a god of a race, a god of a concept, a god of a certain part of nature, such as a god of fire, earth, water, wind, lightning. In Neil Gaiman's New Gods, god of cell phone, god of television. Aspects of reality personified through a being, through a person. Personification of aspects. Now, this is certainly an easy way to do it. The only thing is, if you go this route, it can get a little daunting because there are so many different concepts and perceptions to the world that you can build characters off of. You can sometimes end up with a pantheon that feels kind of like an amalgamation of concepts because they don't really relate to one another. I would recommend, if you do this, in order to make your gods feel uniform or like there's an actual underlying theme to your pantheon, I would recommend picking a certain aspect and coming out with the different compositions of it. For example, in my current game, I'm running a three-sphere system, or three spheres of influence that all the gods are based off of. You have creation, alteration, and destruction. But you could also do things like the elements. You may have elemental gods based off of whatever set of elements you choose. They don't have to just be the four classical elements. You've seen it in plenty of video games and in plenty of RPGs. There can be plenty more elements than that. So you have fire, water, earth, wind, spirit, lightning, the sun, the moon, nature in the sense of plant life, the beast in the sense of, fauna or flora to the fauna. You pick something along those lines where you can pick different aspects of that to have, each set of gods, and that way you can see an inherent relationship between all of them coming together. Otherwise, I mean, you can make it work. You can have a situation where you have different aspects, where you have a god of nature and a god of war, and a god of beekeepers, and a god of the sea. You can have these different aspects to make up your world. You just want to decide what the aspects of the world you want to represent are, and how you wish them to be represented in that god. Typically, you want your god to be a personification of that aspect, made up of the inherent idea behind that aspect. So if you're going to make a god of death, you need to think about how death is perceived in your world and how that makes who they are. Or if you're making a fiery god, naturally, they're probably going to be a passionate god. If you have a very cool and controlled god of flame, then you have a certain perception of how fire works in your world, or at least the mortals there do. And that's really the relation you're looking at, is how is that aspect perceived in that world, because it's going to tell what the personification of that aspect is going to look like. Now, the alternative to coming up with gods based upon the aspect there is coming up to gods based upon a story. Essentially, this is kind of building off of the whole ascendant gods, or just powerful gods. The stories behind who these gods are. Their divinity is not necessarily an aspect of the world, but they're just what they are, or what they've become. So in this case, you may have, like, say, 3 goddesses in your world. None of them really represent an aspect of the world, but they are the 3 goddesses, and each of them has a story behind them, how they came to be. The gods don't necessarily have to have aspects. They can just be characters who happen to be divine. Now, humans or the other mortal races that make churches and cults to them may associate them with certain aspects, but the core of what these gods are is different from the personification. They are not personifications of aspects. More aspects are assigned to them based upon who they are. Once you've come up with your set of gods this way, the next thing to do is to come up with their hierarchy. You want to consider how these gods fit into the world themselves. What are which gods are powerful? Which gods are weak? Which gods are important to the world? Which gods are just kind of there? Which gods are important to mortals? Which gods have nothing to do with mortals? How does the pantheon work? And this kind of leads into the next thing, what is their relation to one another? Are they family, like the Greek pantheon was, where, Zeus was the father of most of, like, the second level of gods, and then those gods had themselves children, which were gods, and then there were also some demigods trickled down there as well. And even all of that came from the Titans, who themselves were a family. So is it, like, how does the hierarchy work? Is there a king of gods? Is there not? Are there, like, 3 gods that are the elder gods, and they are all at war? I know that's the case for my 3 spheres, alteration, creation, and destruction. There's an elder god of each. They're not necessarily at war, but they're the top of the pantheon, and then below them are the other gods of the pantheon. And below them, say, demigods and champions and such. How does the hierarchy work? How is the pantheon formed? And lastly, is the relation of them. Are they... And I'm not talking so much, are they a family unit, or are they like aspects? When I speak of the relation, I mean, how do these gods interact with one another? This is where you get into the fun bits of, say, going back to the Greek pantheon. Okay, this is where it turns into a divine soap opera. Who's banging who? Who likes who? Who hates who? Who was born from who? Who was born from the ashes of who? Who is competitive with who? Who's friends? Who's not friends? It's essentially looking at these divine beings as characters and determining how they interact. the reason why you want to do this, and you want to do this with any of the level of gods, it just may be more broad strokes than fine details, depending on which level you're going on. The reason why you want to do this is it'll dictate which gods are in conflict and which gods go together, which will give you information onto essentially how their churches and cults will interact. If two gods are considered to be lovers, say the god of war and the god of, architecture, then their two churches will probably cooperate with one another often. In fact, you'll probably often see the architecture god building grand fortresses for, the warriors of the god of war's church to dwell in and to use for their wars. Or let's say you have two elder gods at war. Naturally, that means all the aspects underneath are going to be at war. That means all the churches underneath are going to be at war. Essentially, it's going to trickle down from their relations. You may have a trickster god, which is hated by all the other gods because he's a prick. Look at Loki. Not very liked by the other gods. Why? Because, well, he pulls tricks. He backstabs people. He makes them not feel safe. So, what happens to the worshippers of Loki? They're probably pretty often distrusted, or at least kept at arm's length, because you worship a guy who is most known for being a prick. Why would I want to hang around you? Or, let alone, why would you think I would ever play cards with you? Seriously, I'm not going to play cards with you. I'm not going to play dice. I'm never going to let you near my money. Alternatively, I will let you be the bank of the money. I will just never trust that you have as little as you say you have. And that's kind of what you get into. The relationships of the gods will trickle down to their worshippers and how those worshippers are treated by the common masses and by the different churches and such. So, we have a lot of different aspects here to consider. There's actually quite a bit that goes into creating gods, and that's part of the reason why it can feel so daunting when a GM comes into a new world and decides they want to start filling it with gods. That's why for a lot of GMs, it's just easier to pick your favorite pantheon and go from there. Or handpick which gods you like from the different pantheons. But if I left something out, or if you disagreed with something I had to say, please feel free to leave a comment below. Please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep the conversation going. Be sure to follow us on both Twitter and our new Facebook page, Guildmaster Dan on Facebook. And thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hello there, I'm Guildmaster. Hello there, I'm Hello there, Hello there, I'm Guildmaster Dan, and welcome to the fourth wall. Hello there, I don't know what I'm doing. Hello there, I'm Guildmaster. Hello there, I'm Guildmaster Dan, and welcome to the fourth wall. It's been a while since I've done a world good. So the first thing that can